The interstellar medium was not truly empty, though to the unaugmented eye of a biological being, it appeared as an eternal, crushing vacuum. To the sensor arrays of the long-range scout vessel Calibrator, it was a dense tapestry of magnetic flux, high-energy particles, and the faint, ghostly whispers of distant stars. Commander Aris Thorne sat in the command chair, his fingers dancing across a haptic interface that translated the invisible world into tactile feedback. He felt the ship's hull hum against the solar winds, a low-frequency vibration that resonated in his bones. This was the frontier of human-occupied space, a region where the maps grew fuzzy and the radio beacons of civilization faded into the background radiation of the universe. Humanity had been among the stars for 3 centuries, not as conquerors, but as relentless observers and repairers. They were the species that looked at a broken pulsar or a decaying planetary orbit and asked if it could be stabilized. They were the galactic mechanics, the ones who stayed behind to clean up the messes left by more volatile, short-lived empires. The Calibrator was currently tracking a gravitational anomaly that defied the standard models of general relativity. It was a localized distortion, a pucker in the fabric of spacetime that didn't correspond to any visible mass. Aris watched the data streams settle into a coherent pattern. It wasn't a black hole or a rogue planet. It was artificial. The signature was ancient, older than the earliest ruins found on Mars, yet it pulsed with a rhythmic energy that suggested a lingering consciousness. Beside him, Science Officer Vane monitored the spectrographic analysis. Vane was a man of few words, preferring the elegance of a well-formed equation to the messiness of conversation. He pointed to a spike in the ultraviolet spectrum that shouldn't have been there. It was a signal, encoded not in radio waves or light pulses, but in the subtle shifting of atomic weights within the local space. It was a message written in the very language of matter itself, a feat of engineering that made human achievements look like a child's building blocks. As the vessel drew closer to the anomaly, the visual sensors began to resolve a shape. It was a vast, crystalline lattice, kilometers across, suspended in the dark. It didn't reflect the light of the nearby stars. It seemed to drink it, glowing from within with a soft, amber radiance. This was the Great Reliquary, a mythic structure spoken of in the fragmented records of the Xyloth, a species that had vanished from the galactic stage 10,000 years prior. The Xyloth had been keepers of history, and it was said they had built a vault to preserve the biological and cultural blueprints of every sentient race they encountered. If the Calibrator had truly found it, the discovery would reshape the understanding of the galaxy's past. Aris felt a surge of adrenaline, the familiar mix of curiosity and caution that had driven him to the edges of the known. He ordered the ship to a full stop, maintaining a respectful distance from the crystalline structure. They were guests in a graveyard of memories, and he had no intention of being the one to accidentally kick over a tombstone. Communication attempts were met with a steady, unvarying drone. It wasn't a rejection, but a status report. The reliquary was operational, but its caretakers were long gone. The station was running on an automated cycle of maintenance and observation, its systems powered by the rotational energy of the galaxy itself. Aris called for a briefing in the Situation Room. The crew of the Calibrator was small, only 12 specialists, but they were the best the Terran Restoration Initiative had to offer. There was Sarah, the lead engineer who could talk to a fusion reactor like it was a stubborn pet. Marcus, the linguist who specialized in nonlinear symbolic languages. And Jorah, the medic who knew more about alien biology than most xenobiologists. They gathered around the holographic projection of the lattice, their faces illuminated by the amber glow. The atmosphere was one of hushed reverence. They knew they were looking at the pinnacle of a civilization that had mastered the laws of the universe, and yet they were the ones standing there, alive and breathing, while the Xyloth were nothing but whispers in the dark. The challenge was clear. The reliquary was failing. Despite its advanced design, 10 millennia of micrometeoroid impacts and cosmic ray degradation had taken their toll. The lattice was fractured in several key nodes, and the internal power distribution was becoming unstable. If the structure collapsed, the data it held, the genetic codes of thousands of species, the records of vanished worlds, would be lost forever. The initiative's mandate was simple: preserve life, preserve knowledge. Aris looked at his team and saw the same determination in their eyes. They weren't here for gold or territory. They were here because the universe was a lonely place, and every piece of history saved was a victory against the encroaching darkness. They would have to board the Reliquator, navigate its alien corridors, and find a way to patch a system they barely understood using technology that was, by comparison, prehistoric. Preparation for the EVA began immediately. The crew donned their pressurized suits, checking and double-checking the seals and oxygen levels. The airlocks hissed as they cycled, a sound that always reminded Aris of the fragility of their existence. Outside the ship, the silence was absolute, a heavy weight that pressed against the mind. They used thruster packs to bridge the gap between the Calibrator and the crystalline lattice. Up close, the reliquary was even more imposing. The crystalline struts were translucent, revealing complex networks of fiber optics and fluid-filled conduits that looked like the circulatory system of a giant beast. It wasn't just a machine, it was a biomechanical hybrid, a living testament to the Xyloth's philosophy that there was no distinction between technology and nature. Aris touched the surface of a strut, expecting cold stone, but felt instead a faint warmth, as if the station was generating its own fever to fight off the cold of space. Entering the reliquary required finding a port that still responded to external stimuli. Marcus directed them to a section where the amber glow was strongest, theorizing that the station's automated defense and docking systems would be most active there. After several minutes of searching, they found a circular indentation that reacted to the touch of a laser-ranging tool. The crystal wall shimmered and then dissolved into a fine mist of nanites, allowing the team to pass through before reforming behind them. They were inside. The air within the station was thick and smelled faintly of ozone and dried flowers, a scent that had no business being in a 10,000-year-old vault. Gravity was present, a gentle pull that felt like 60% of Earth's norm. The corridors were wide and arched, the walls pulsing with the same amber light they had seen from the outside. It was beautiful, terrifying, and profoundly alien. As they moved deeper into the structure, the team encountered the first signs of the station's distress. Sections of the floor were missing, replaced by shimmering force fields that flickered dangerously. The ambient temperature fluctuated wildly, jumping from freezing to sweltering in the span of a few meters. They reached a central hub where several corridors converged. In the center of the room sat a massive pillar of light, a vertical stream of data that seemed to be the heart of the reliquary's processing unit. Here, the hum was louder, a discordant vibration that suggested the system was struggling to process a massive internal error. Marcus stepped forward, his handheld translator chirping as it tried to make sense of the symbols flickering across the pillar. He shook his head, the frustration clear even through his helmet visor. The language was too complex, the syntax too fluid for the current human algorithms to decrypt in real time. They needed a direct interface, a way to bridge the gap between human thought and Xyloth logic. Aris knew the risks of a direct neural link. The initiative had developed the technology for interfacing with human computers, but an alien system of this magnitude could easily overwhelm a biological mind. Yet, looking at the flickering pillar, he knew they didn't have much time. The structural integrity of the hub was already beginning to fail, and a massive energy surge was building up in the lower levels. If they didn't stabilize the core now, the reliquary would self-destruct to prevent its data from being corrupted. He volunteered for the link, ignoring the protests of Jorah and Vane. He was the commander. The responsibility for the mission's success and the safety of his crew rested on him. He approached the pillar, extending a gloved hand toward the stream of light. As his fingers touched the data stream, the world exploded into a kaleidoscope of sensation. He wasn't Aris Thorne anymore. He was 1,000 different people on 1,000 different worlds. He felt the heat of a triple-sun system on his skin, the pressure of a methane ocean on his lungs, and the vibration of a tectonic shift beneath his feet. He saw the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth of stars, and the slow, inevitable cooling of the universe. The Xyloth hadn't just recorded data, they had recorded experience. The reliquary was a repository of the soul of the galaxy, but within this vast ocean of memory, there was a scream, a digital shriek of agony. The system was dying because it was lonely. The Xyloth had programmed it to observe and record, but they had never given it the capacity to let go. 10,000 years of accumulated sorrow and joy were pressing against the station's capacity, a weight that no machine, no matter how advanced, could bear forever. Aris realized that the physical damage to the station was a symptom, not the cause. The reliquary was failing because its storage was full, and its protocols forbade it from deleting anything. It was a hoarder of history, choking on the very legacy it was meant to protect. To save the station, he didn't need to fix a circuit or patch a leak. He needed to teach the machine how to mourn and how to move on. He reached out with his own mind, offering his human perspective, the perspective of a species that lived short, intense lives and understood the necessity of endings. He shared the concept of a funeral, the idea of a legacy that lived on in the stories told by the survivors rather than in a cold database. He showed the machine the beauty of a sunset, a phenomenon that was beautiful precisely because it was temporary. The discordance in the pillar of light began to smooth out. The amber glow shifted to a soft, cool blue. The station's systems responded to Aris's input, not by deleting the data, but by compressing it, transforming raw experience into wisdom. The pressure within the hub eased, and the flickering force fields stabilized. Aris felt the connection begin to fade, the vast consciousness of the reliquary retreating back into its crystalline shell. He slumped against the pillar, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Jorah was there in an instant, checking his vitals and helping him to his feet. He was exhausted, his mind scarred by the sheer volume of information he had processed, but he was alive. And more importantly, the reliquary was stable. The amber light returned, but it was no longer the frantic, feverish glow of a dying organism. It was the steady, calm light of a guardian at peace. They spent the next several days working alongside the station's newly stabilized systems. With the core functioning correctly, the reliquary's internal nanites were able to repair the structural damage. Sarah coordinated with the station's automated repair drones, marveling at the efficiency of their design. Marcus and Vane began the painstaking process of downloading a filtered version of the Xyloth's archives, the knowledge that would help humanity understand its place in the grand design of the cosmos. They learned of the Great Accord, a period of peace that had lasted for eons, and the quiet transition, the era when the elder races had decided to leave the physical realm for something else, leaving behind their legacies for the younger species to find. It was a humbling realization. Humanity wasn't the first, and they wouldn't be the last, but they were the ones who were here now, and they had a role to play. As the Calibrator prepared to depart, Aris stood one last time on the observation deck, looking out at the crystalline lattice. It was no longer just a relic of a dead race, it was a beacon. They had left behind a relay station of their own, a small, human-built buoy that would broadcast a signal to any other travelers who might happen upon this corner of the void. The message was simple: you are not alone. We were here, and we remembered you. The reliquary would continue its long watch, but it would no longer do so in silence. It had the memories of the Xyloth, and now it had the story of 12 humans who had risked everything to save a past that wasn't even their own. This was the essence of the initiative, the core of what it meant to be human in an infinite universe. They were the ones who cared when no one else was left to care. The journey back to the nearest human outpost would take weeks, but the atmosphere on the ship had changed. There was a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. They weren't just explorers anymore, they were inheritors. The data they carried would take generations to fully understand, but the lesson they had learned in the heart of the reliquary was clear. Life, in all its forms, was precious not because it lasted forever, but because it mattered in the moment. Aris looked at his crew, exhausted, dirty, but wearing the quiet smiles of those who had seen something miraculous and felt a profound sense of pride. They had faced the vastness of time and the weight of 1 billion lost lives, and they hadn't blinked. They had reached out a hand in the dark, and the universe had reached back. As the Calibrator entered warp, the crystalline lattice vanished from the viewports, but its amber light remained burned into their minds, a warm promise against the cold of the void. The return to the orbital station known as Bastion Prime was not the triumphant procession one might expect for a crew that had touched the heart of an ancient civilization. Instead, it was a quiet, clinical affair, dictated by the stringent quarantine protocols of the Terran Restoration Initiative. Aris and his crew were sequestered in the observation wing, a transparent spire that looked out over the swirling turquoise and white clouds of the garden world below. For 2 weeks, they underwent exhaustive psychological and biological screening to ensure that the neural link with the reliquary had not left behind any malignant artifacts. Jorah paced the confines of the common room, her frustration mounting as the days bled into one another. She was a healer by nature, and being the subject of constant monitoring by automated medical drones felt like a personal affront to her professional dignity. Vane, conversely, seemed perfectly content, spending his hours staring into the depths of the data crystals they had retrieved, his eyes reflecting the flickering amber light of the Xyloth records. Aris spent most of his time at the reinforced window, watching the construction of the new generation of deep space vessels in the high-orbit shipyards. These ships were sleeker, more organic in their lines, incorporating the geometric principles they had glimpsed within the crystalline lattice. The discovery was already trickling down through the scientific community, sparking a renaissance in materials science and energy distribution. The Council of the Initiative had been briefed via encrypted burst transmissions, and the atmosphere on the station was one of electric anticipation. They were no longer just the janitors of the galaxy. They were the students of a master class that had been out of session for 10 millennia. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, but it was a burden Aris carried with a strange sense of peace. He still felt the echoes of the reliquary in his mind, the collective sigh of 1 trillion souls finally finding a place to rest. When the quarantine was finally lifted, the crew was summoned to the Grand Assembly, a chamber designed to hold representatives from every major human colony and habitat. It was a space of soaring arches and soft, ambient lighting, meant to evoke the ancient cathedrals of Earth while embracing the minimalist aesthetic of the spacefaring age. The High Chancellor, a woman whose face was a map of a century spent navigating the complexities of colonial politics, stood at the podium. She did not speak of conquest or the acquisition of superior weaponry. Instead, she spoke of the duty of the living to the dead and the obligation of the present to the future. She looked directly at Aris as she spoke, acknowledging that the survival of the reliquary was a testament to the human capacity for empathy, a trait that many of the more aggressive species in the galaxy's history had discarded as a weakness. The data Marcus and Vane had extracted was revealed in stages. It wasn't just a list of names and dates. It was a functional map of the galaxy's hidden infrastructure. The Xyloth had not just observed, they had built a network of stabilized wormholes and energy relays that spanned the spiral arms, most of which had fallen into dormancy. The reliquary was the control hub for this network, the Loom that could weave the disparate threads of the galaxy back into a cohesive whole. If humanity could reactivate even a fraction of this system, the distance between colonies would shrink from months of warp travel to minutes of transit. The implications for trade, disaster relief, and cultural exchange were staggering, but the Chancellor also issued a warning. This technology was a gift, but it was also a test. The Xyloth had vanished not because of war or famine, but because they had reached a point where their physical existence could no longer contain their collective consciousness. They had evolved beyond the need for the Loom, leaving it behind for those who still walked the path of the material. Aris was promoted to Fleet Commander of the newly formed Restoration Corps, a fleet tasked not with defense, but with the systematic repair of the galactic infrastructure. His first mission was to lead a task force to the Serpentis Cluster, a region of space where 3 of the Loom's primary relays were located. These relays were essential for stabilizing the gravitational tides of the cluster, which were currently threatening several inhabited systems with unpredictable orbital shifts. The Calibrator was refitted with the latest Xyloth-derived technology, its engines now humming with a resonance that mirrored the amber glow of the reliquary. Sarah spent weeks in the engine room, her hands stained with exotic lubricants as she integrated the new power cores. She often joked that the ship felt like it was finally waking up from a long, groggy nap. The transition to the Serpentis cluster was the first true test of the integrated navigation systems. Instead of the jarring lurch of a standard warp jump, the Calibrator seemed to slide into a fold in space, the stars outside the viewports stretching into long, iridescent ribbons of light. The journey, which would have normally taken 3 weeks, was completed in less than 4 hours. When they emerged into the cluster, they were greeted by a sight of terrifying beauty. The 3 sons of Serpentis were locked in a complex gravitational dance, their solar flares intertwining like the fiery limbs of giants. The local planets were being buffeted by intense radiation and tectonic instability. The primary relay, a massive obsidian ring orbiting the central star, was spinning out of control, its stabilization thrusters long since exhausted. The mission was far more dangerous than the boarding of the reliquary. The radiation levels were high enough to fry standard electronics, and the gravitational shear was intense enough to tear a ship apart if they got too close. Aris had to rely on the new shielding arrays Sarah had installed, which used harmonic interference to negate the effects of the solar winds. They approached the obsidian ring with agonizing slowness. The structure was ancient and lacked the crystalline elegance of the reliquary. It was a brutal, functional piece of engineering designed to handle immense forces. Marcus identified the access codes from the archives, but the relay's receiver was damaged, its surface pitted by millions of years of micrometeoroid impacts. They would have to perform a manual override from the external control housing. This time, the EVA was a battle against the elements. Aris and a team of 4 engineers stepped out into a chaotic environment of blinding light and invisible force. Their suits groaned under the pressure of the gravitational waves. The obsidian surface of the relay was slick and difficult to grip, requiring the use of high-intensity magnetic clamps. One of the engineers, a young man named Harlan, was nearly swept away when a sudden flare from the central sun caused a localized surge in the relay's magnetic field. Aris caught him by the tether, his own arm straining against the sudden weight. They huddled against a protruding sensor mast, waiting for the surge to pass. The heat was palpable, even through the multi-layered insulation of their suits. It felt as if the stars themselves were trying to push them away, guarding the secrets of the Loom with jealous ferocity. They reached the control housing, a recessed bunker near the relay's inner rim. It was filled with a thick, gelatinous cooling fluid that had turned to a sludge-like consistency over the eons. Sarah set to work, her movements precise despite the bulky gloves. She had to bypass the primary logic gates and feed a direct power jolt from the Calibrator's core into the relay's stabilization processors. As she worked, Aris looked out across the span of the obsidian ring. He could see the other 2 relays in the distance, dim sparks against the backdrop of the swirling solar fire. He realized then that the Xyloth hadn't just built these things to help themselves. They had built them to protect the life that would inevitably arise after they were gone. The relays were a planetary-scale shepherd's crook, keeping the worlds of Serpentis in their proper place. The moment of truth came when Sarah initiated the power transfer. A beam of pure white energy arced from the Calibrator to the relay's receiver. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the obsidian ring began to vibrate. The sludge in the control housing began to glow with a soft, pulsing light. The spinning of the ring slowed, the massive structure correcting its orientation with a series of deep, metallic thuds that Aris could feel through the soles of his boots. The gravitational sensors on his HUD stabilized. The Loom was beginning to weave again. Across the cluster, the other 2 relays responded to the signal, their own stabilization sequences firing in a synchronized sequence that had been silent for 10,000 years. The orbital decay of the nearby planets slowed, then stopped. The giants had been put back on their leashes. Back on the Calibrator, the mood was one of quiet exhaustion and profound relief. They had saved 3 worlds and millions of lives, not through force of arms, but through the application of ancient wisdom and modern grit. Jorah treated the minor radiation burns and muscle strains of the EVA team, her touch gentle and her voice full of a rare, soft praise. Marcus was already documenting the event, noting that the relay's interface had accepted the human power signature with surprising ease. It suggested that the Xyloth had designed their systems to be compatible with a wide range of biological and technological frameworks, almost as if they had anticipated the arrival of a species like humanity, a species that would go to any lengths to fix what was broken. That evening, Aris sat alone in the small observation lounge at the back of the ship. He watched the Serpentis suns, now stable and serene, and thought about the billions of years that had preceded this moment. Humanity was so young, so new to the stage, and yet they had been given the keys to the kingdom. He thought about the reliquary and the way it had shared its loneliness with him. He realized that the greatest strength of humanity wasn't their technology or their intellect, but their willingness to stand in the gap. They were the bridge builders. They were the ones who saw a dying star or a broken machine and felt a kinship with it. As the Calibrator prepared to move on to the next relay, Aris felt a sense of belonging he had never known on Earth. The galaxy was a vast, complicated, and often broken place, but it was their home now, and they were going to make sure it stayed that way, one relay at a time. The mission continued for months, as the task force moved from system to system, reigniting the dormant nodes of the Loom. Each success brought more data, more understanding, and more allies. Other species, long isolated in their own small pockets of the void, began to reach out as the communication relays came back online. They were cautious at first, fearful of this new power, but the Restoration Corps was always clear in its intent. They didn't want tribute, they wanted cooperation. They shared the blueprints for the stabilization technology, teaching others how to maintain the relays in their own sectors. The Loom was becoming a collective project, a grand tapestry being woven by 1,000 different hands. Aris watched as the map of the galaxy in the Situation Room grew brighter and more connected with every passing week. Despite the progress, Aris couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. The deeper they went into the archives of the reliquary, the more they found references to something called the fading. It wasn't a war or a disease, but a phenomenon that the Xyloth had feared, a gradual loss of complexity in the universe, a trend toward entropy that even their greatest machines couldn't fully halt. The Loom was a temporary solution, a way to hold back the tide, but it wasn't a cure. Aris knew that eventually they would have to face the fading itself, but for now they would do what humans did best. They would keep the lights on, they would patch the leaks, they would make sure that the next generation had a foundation to build upon. And they would do it with a smile, a bit of wit, and a relentless belief that no matter how dark the night, the dawn was always worth the wait. The Calibrator turned its nose toward the galactic rim, toward a region known as the Silent Reach. There, the archives suggested, sat the primary anchor for the entire Loom. If the relays were the threads, the anchor was the frame. It was the most ambitious goal they had set yet, a journey into the deepest unknown. Aris looked at his crew, the engineers, the scientists, the medics, and saw a family. They had come a long way from the scout vessel that had stumbled upon a crystalline lattice in the dark. They were the vanguard of a new era, the architects of a galaxy that was finally learning to breathe again. As the ship slipped into the iridescent fold of the Loom once more, Aris felt the familiar hum of the hull and the steady beat of his own heart, two rhythms in perfect sync with the pulse of the stars. The transit to the Silent Reach was unlike any other jump the crew of the Calibrator had experienced. Usually, the space between the stars felt like a medium to be traversed, a distance to be overcome with the brute force of engines or the clever folding of physics. This time, the ship seemed to slide into a pocket of existence that was profoundly still. The usual chromatic aberration of the Loom's slipstreams settled into a flat, monochromatic silver. Outside the viewports, the stars did not streak. They shimmered like coins at the bottom of a deep, clear well. Aris watched the sensor telemetry with a furrowed brow. The gravitational constant in this sector was slightly lower than the galactic average, as if the laws of physics were being applied with a lighter touch. It was a region of space that the Xyloth records described as the foundation of the galaxy, the place where the first seeds of the Loom had been sown before the Great Accord had even been a concept. The Silent Reach was so named not for a lack of sound being impossible in a vacuum anyway, but for the peculiar lack of background radiation. The cosmic microwave background, that faint afterglow of the universe's birth, was muted here, dampened by some immense artificial influence. As the Calibrator decelerated into real space, the anchor revealed itself. It was not a lattice like the reliquary or a ring like the Serpentis relays. It was a sphere, perfectly smooth and polished to a mirror finish, roughly the size of a small moon. It hung in the absolute center of a void 3 light-years across, with no nearby stars to illuminate it. The only light came from the Calibrator's own external floods, which reflected off the sphere's surface in long, distorted streaks. It looked like a drop of liquid mercury suspended in the dark, a silent sentinel watching over the void. Vane was the first to notice the temporal discrepancy. According to the ship's internal chronometers, they had been in transit for exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes. However, the atomic clocks synced to the galactic pulse suggested that nearly 4 days had passed in the universe outside the reach. The anchor was warping time itself, creating a localized bubble where entropy moved at a crawl. This was the Xyloth's answer to the fading, a sanctuary where the heat death of the universe could be delayed indefinitely. Aris felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's life support. To build such a thing required a mastery of energy that bordered on the divine. He wondered if humanity was truly ready to touch the controls of a machine that could bargain with time. The sphere had no visible ports, no antennas, and no obvious means of propulsion. It simply existed. Sarah spent hours scanning the surface with every frequency at her disposal, but the mirror-finish hull reflected everything back with 100% efficiency. It was a perfect thermodynamic seal. The only way in was the way Aris had entered the reliquary, through a direct interface. But this time, the stakes were higher. The anchor was the heart of the entire network. If he made a mistake here, the feedback loop could collapse every relay they had painstakingly reactivated, potentially causing gravitational catastrophes across dozens of inhabited systems. He gathered his senior staff in the galley, where the smell of recycled coffee and synthetic protein provided a grounding contrast to the cosmic scale of their mission. Jorah was the most vocal opponent of another direct link. She pointed to the neurological scarring on Aris's recent brain scans, faint traces of synaptic overload that hadn't quite faded. She argued that the human mind was a glass vessel trying to hold the contents of an ocean, and eventually the glass would shatter. Marcus, however, pointed out that the anchor was currently in a state of stasis. Without a biological catalyst to provide a point of reference, the machine would remain closed, a tomb for the technology they needed. They debated for hours, the conversation circling the fundamental question of their mission. Were they there to observe the past, or were they there to claim the future? Aris listened to them both, his eyes fixed on the silver sphere on the monitor. He knew that the Xyloth hadn't built this as a tomb. It was a seed waiting for the right soil. The decision was made to attempt a collective link. If the burden of the data was too much for one mind, they would distribute it across 4. Aris, Vane, Marcus, and Sarah would use a synchronized neural bridge, a piece of experimental tech they had developed at Bastion Prime based on the reliquary's design. Jorah would remain at the monitors, ready to sever the connection the moment she detected any sign of neural collapse. They set up the interface in the ship's core, sitting in a circle with their hands resting on a central crystalline manifold. As the connection initiated, Aris felt the familiar rush of light, but this time he wasn't alone. He could feel Sarah's pragmatic, mechanical thoughts, Vane's cold, analytical logic, and Marcus's fluid, linguistic interpretations. They were a four-headed entity, a composite human mind. The anchor opened to them not as a physical space, but as a conceptual one. They found themselves standing in a recreation of an ancient Xyloth city, a place of white stone and flowing water beneath a sky filled with 2 moons. It was a memory palace, a virtual environment designed to facilitate communication between the machine and its users. Standing in the center of a great plaza was a figure that looked remarkably like a human, though its skin had a faint metallic sheen and its eyes were pools of starlight. It was the anchor's heuristic interface, a manifestation of the station's artificial intelligence. It did not speak in words, it spoke in shared understandings. Through the collective link, the team learned the true purpose of the anchor. It wasn't just a stabilizer, it was a refinery. The Xyloth had discovered that consciousness itself was a form of low-entropy energy. By connecting sentient minds through the Loom, the network could harvest the waste energy of thought and use it to counteract the natural decay of the universe. The fading was the result of a galaxy growing quiet as older races died out or ascended, leaving behind a void that entropy was quick to fill. Humanity's arrival on the galactic stage, with their noisy, vibrant, and highly active minds, was exactly what the system needed to restart. They were the fuel the Loom had been waiting for. The Xyloth hadn't just left them the keys, they had left them the responsibility of keeping the universe from going cold. The interface showed them the current state of the Loom. The relays they had fixed were glowing brightly, but the rest of the galaxy was a web of dark threads. To fully reactivate the system, they needed to initiate a resonance event, a simultaneous broadcast from the anchor to every dormant node. This would require the anchor to briefly draw upon the collective consciousness of every human being currently connected to the initiative's commsnet. It wouldn't harm anyone, but it would create a moment of total, planet-wide telepathic unity. It was a terrifying prospect, the end of privacy, the sudden merging of billions of inner worlds. Aris felt Sarah's hesitation, Vane's calculation of the risks, and Marcus's awe at the linguistic possibilities. The AI waited, its starlight eyes fixed on the composite mind. It was a choice that only a biological species could make. The machine could not force the connection, it had to be offered freely. Aris reached out to his teammates within the link. He showed them the worlds they had saved in the Serpentis cluster, the children who would grow up under stable suns because they had intervened. He showed them the reliquary and the trillion souls who had found peace because someone had listened to their story. He argued that the cost of privacy was small compared to the price of a dying galaxy. One by one, their hesitations crumbled. Sarah saw the engineering beauty of a restored cosmos. Vane saw the ultimate data set. Marcus saw the birth of a universal language. They gave their consent. The anchor pulsed. The silver sphere outside the calibrator began to glow with a blinding, iridescent light that transcended the visible spectrum. On Earth, on Bastion Prime, on the mining colonies of the asteroid belts and the research stations of the outer rims, every human being stopped. For a single, eternal second, there was no I, only we. A mother in a high-rise in Neo-Tokyo felt the exhaustion of a miner on a Jovian moon. A scientist in a lab felt the joy of a child playing in the red sands of Mars. The barriers fell away, and for that heartbeat, the entire human race understood one another perfectly. There was no hate, no fear, no secrets, just the overwhelming warmth of billions of souls breathing in unison. The energy generated by this moment of unity was channeled through the anchor and out into the Loom. The silver sphere sent a ripple through spacetime, a wave of low-entropy force that raced across the light years. In the silent reach, the dark threads of the map began to ignite. Relays that had been cold for 10 millennia flickered to life, their obsidian and crystalline hulls humming with newfound purpose. The gravitational tides of the galaxy shifted, settling into a more stable, harmonious rhythm. The fading was pushed back. The universe didn't just feel brighter, it felt more solid, as if the very fabric of reality had been reinforced. The resonance event ended as quickly as it had begun, leaving the human race gasping for breath, forever changed by the memory of the union. Back on the calibrator, the four-way link severed. Aris, Sarah, Vane, and Marcus collapsed into their chairs, their faces pale and their eyes wide with the afterimage of the collective. Jorah was moving between them, checking pulses and administering stabilizers, her hands shaking slightly. She, too, had felt the resonance. She had felt the collective pain of her patients, but also the collective hope of the doctors trying to save them. The silence in the ship's core was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of the void. It was the comfortable silence of people who knew each other's souls. They had done it. The loom was fully active, and the silent reach was silent no more. The silver sphere was now a vibrant, pulsing heart, pumping life into the furthest corners of the spiral arm. The anchor's interface had left them with one final gift, the coordinates for the Grand Nexus, the place where the Xyloth had eventually gone. It wasn't a physical location in this universe, but a doorway. They weren't meant to follow yet. Humanity still had much work to do in the material realm, but the invitation was there. The path was open. Aris stood up, his legs feeling heavy but certain. He looked at his team, then at the view screen where the silver sphere was slowly fading back into its mirror-finish stasis, its job for the moment complete. They had moved from being the galaxy's janitors to its guardians, and finally to its battery. It was a strange, exhausting, and beautiful destiny. As they began the journey back to Bastion Prime, the Calibrator was no longer a lone scout vessel. It was the flagship of a new era. The signals coming in from the rest of the colonies were a chaotic, wonderful mess of voices, everyone trying to process the resonance at once. There would be challenges, of course. The social and political fallout of a moment of total telepathy would take years to resolve. But the fundamental truth had changed. They knew, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that they were part of something larger. The loom was a physical manifestation of that truth. Aris sat in his command chair, listening to the hum of the hull, a sound that now seemed to carry the faint, distant harmony of billions of voices. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he truly felt at home in the universe. The return from the silent reach was marked by a shift in the very fabric of human society. The resonance had not been a mere flash of light or a momentary glitch in the comsnet. It had been a fundamental rewiring of the collective psyche. On Bastion Prime, the corridors were no longer filled with the hurried, competitive energy of a species scrambling for resources. There was a newfound patience, a deliberate slowing of the pulse. When people looked at one another, there was a flash of recognition that went beyond the surface. They had shared the same breath, the same momentary terror, and the same transcendent joy. Aris found that he no longer needed to give long, detailed orders to his crew. A nod, a gesture, or a simple sentence was often enough to convey a complex intent. The Calibrator had become more than a ship. It was a limb of a larger body, and Aris was the nerve ending that felt the first touch of the unknown. The coordinates provided by the anchor led to a region of space known as the Void of Ophiuchus, a vast expanse of nothingness between the spiral arms where the stars were so sparse that the sky looked like a velvet shroud. It was here, in the loneliest part of the galaxy, that the Xyloth had constructed the Nexus Gate. Unlike the other structures they had encountered, the gate was not made of crystal or obsidian. It was a tier in the geometry of space, held open by 6 massive pylons that resembled the fingers of a buried giant reaching out from the dark. These pylons were constructed of a material that absorbed all light, appearing as absolute silhouettes against the distant, hazy backdrop of the galactic core. They did not pulse or glow, they simply existed, vibrating with a frequency so low it could only be felt as a dull ache in the marrow of one's bones. As the Calibrator approached the pylons, the ship's systems began to fail in subtle, strange ways. The internal gravity fluctuated, making the crew feel as if they were walking through water one moment and floating the next. The clocks on the walls began to run backward, then stopped entirely, as if time itself was refusing to enter the proximity of the gate. Sarah reported that the fusion reactor was running at 100% efficiency, despite the fuel intake being cut to nearly zero. The laws of thermodynamics were beginning to fray at the edges. Aris ordered the ship to a halt at the edge of the pylon's influence. They were standing at the threshold of the Great Transition, the doorway through which an entire civilization had stepped into the beyond. It was a place of profound finality, yet it felt strangely like a beginning. The Council of the Initiative had sent a secondary fleet to support the Calibrator, but Aris had requested they maintain a distance of 1 light-year. He felt, instinctively, that the gate would not react well to a show of force. This was a place for a single voice, not a chorus. He spent his hours in the observation lounge, staring at the silhouettes of the pylons. He thought about the Xyloth and why they had chosen this place. It was far from the beauty of the nebulae and the energy of the star nurseries. It was a place of pure, unadulterated vacuum. Perhaps, he mused, they wanted to ensure that their departure left no ripples in the physical world, a clean break from the material to the metaphysical. Or perhaps they simply wanted a quiet place to say goodbye. The task of activating the gate fell to Marcus and Vane. The Xyloth records indicated that the gate required a harmonic key, a specific sequence of thoughts and mathematical constants that would resonate with the pylon's internal structure. This wasn't something that could be broadcast from a computer. It had to be generated by a living mind. After the experience at the anchor, the team was better prepared for the mental strain, but the gate was a different beast entirely. Where the anchor had been a repository of memory, the gate was an engine of transformation. It was designed to break down the barrier between the individual and the infinite. Aris knew that whoever volunteered to provide the key might not come back the same, or might not come back at all. Jorah was the most hesitant. She had watched Aris and the others recover from the resonance, noting the subtle changes in their behavior, the way they would sometimes stare into space for minutes at a time, or the way they seemed to anticipate each other's words. She feared that the gate would finish what the anchor had started, dissolving the boundaries of the self until there was nothing left but a ghost in the machine. But Vane was resolute. He argued that the fading was still a threat, and that the only way to truly understand how to save the galaxy was to speak with those who had already faced it. He volunteered to be the primary conduit for the key, with Aris and Sarah acting as anchors to pull him back if he drifted too far. The ritual of activation took place in the main hangar, which had been cleared of all equipment to create a neutral space. Vane sat in the center of the floor, surrounded by a ring of sensors. He looked small and fragile against the backdrop of the massive pylons visible through the hangar's atmospheric shield. Aris and Sarah stood on either side of him, their hands resting on his shoulders. As Vane began to focus his mind on the mathematical sequences, the pylons outside began to react. The absolute black of their surfaces began to bleed into the surrounding space, creating a distortion that looked like oil on water. The ache in Aris's bones intensified, becoming a low-frequency roar that filled his entire consciousness. He felt Vane's mind beginning to expand, reaching out toward the dark fingers of the gate. The transition was not a burst of light, but a sudden absence of shadow. The hangar vanished, replaced by a gray, featureless expanse that stretched infinitely in all directions. Vane was no longer sitting. He was suspended in the center of a great, shimmering web. This was the nexus, the bridge between the physical universe and the realm the Xyloth had moved into. Aris and Sarah were there too, but they were reduced to flickers of intent, mere tethered shadows of their physical selves. Standing before them was the interface they had met at the anchor, but it was no longer a single figure. It was a shifting mosaic of faces, a collective representation of the Xyloth. They did not communicate in images or thoughts, but in pure, unfiltered meaning. The Xyloth revealed the truth of the fading. It was not a natural process of entropy, but a consequence of the galaxy's maturation. As a galaxy ages, the density of consciousness increases, and the laws of physics become more rigid to accommodate the complexity of life. Eventually, the weight of this complexity becomes too much for the physical realm to support, and the galaxy begins to thin out, losing its ability to sustain biological existence. The Xyloth had moved to the Nexus to alleviate this pressure, becoming a sort of galactic nervous system that could manage the transition of younger races. They had been waiting for humanity because humans were the first species to show a capacity for lateral empathy, the ability to care for things that were fundamentally different from themselves, even things that were long dead. The Xyloth offered a choice. Humanity could continue as they were, maintaining the Loom and fighting a losing battle against the fading, or they could become the new caretakers of the Nexus. This would mean a gradual evolution of the species, a shedding of the physical form over thousands of years to become something more. It was a path of ascension, but it was also a path of profound sacrifice. It meant leaving behind the world of touch and taste and smell for a world of pure thought and connection. Aris felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him. He looked at Vane, whose mind was drinking in the infinite knowledge of the Xyloth, and at Sarah, who was marveling at the underlying architecture of the universe. He realized that this wasn't a choice for a single man or even a single crew. He spoke to the Xyloth, his voice resonating through the grey expanse. He told them that humanity was not ready to leave. They were a young species, still in love with the feeling of the wind on their faces and the taste of the salt sea. They were a species of builders and fixers, and their work in the physical realm was far from finished. He proposed a middle path. Humanity would remain the guardians of the physical galaxy, using the knowledge of the Nexus to heal the fading and prepare other species for the transition. They would be the bridge builders between the material and the infinite, the ones who ensured that the light of consciousness never went out, no matter how much the universe thinned. The Xyloth mosaic shifted, the faces reflecting a mixture of surprise and profound respect. They had expected a yes or a no, they had not expected a counter-proposal. After a long moment of silence that felt like an eternity, the grey expanse began to ripple. The Xyloth agreed. They would provide the breath of life, a template for advanced energy manipulation that would allow humanity to rejuvenate dying stars and stabilize planetary cores on a galactic scale. In return, humanity would take on the mantle of the Grand Accord, ensuring that no species was left behind in the dark. The gate would remain open, not as a shortcut to ascension, but as a library and a sanctuary for those who needed guidance. The return to the physical world was a violent, jarring experience. Aris, Vane, and Sarah were thrown back into the hangar as the pylons outside underwent a spectacular transformation. The silhouettes shattered like glass, revealing cores of pure, incandescent white light. The gate was no longer a dark hole. It was a beacon, a second sun in the heart of the Ophiuchus void. The Calibrator's systems surged back to life, the internal clocks spinning wildly until they synchronized with the new, stabilized time signature of the region. Vane remained on the floor for a long time, his eyes wide and unfocused, but he was breathing. Jorah rushed to him, her face a mask of relief and concern. They had touched the face of the infinite and come back with the fire of the gods. In the days that followed, the news of the Grand Accord spread like a wildfire through the human colonies. The breath of life, data, was translated into engineering blueprints that seemed to defy every law of physics humanity had ever known. They began to build atmospheric healers and solar igniters, machines that could turn a barren rock into a garden world in a matter of decades. The era of restoration had ended, and the era of rejuvenation had begun. Humanity was no longer just survivalists in a cold universe. They were the gardeners of the stars. Aris stood on the bridge of the Calibrator, watching as the first of the solar igniters was deployed toward a nearby red dwarf. He felt a sense of immense pride, not just in his crew, but in his entire race. They had been offered heaven and had chosen to stay in the dirt to make it better for everyone else. The mission of the Calibrator was far from over. There were still millions of light years to explore, thousands of broken worlds to mend, and countless new species to welcome into the Grand Accord. As the ship prepared to jump to the next system, Aris looked at the white light of the Nexus gate one last time. It was a reminder of what they could become, but also of what they had chosen to be. They were human, with all the messiness and beauty that entailed. They were the species that wouldn't leave until the job was done. And as the ship slipped into the stabilized slipstream of the Loom, Aris knew that the job was just getting started. The universe was a vast, complicated, and often broken place, but it was their garden now, and they were going to make it bloom. The transition from the Ophiuchus void to the Eridanus supervoid was a journey across the most desolate stretch of the known universe. While the rest of the galaxy was becoming a vibrant web of connected relays and rejuvenated stars, the Eridanus sector remained a cold, expanding scar where galaxies themselves seemed to have been plucked out by a divine hand. It was the perfect proving ground for the breath of life. The Calibrator arrived at the edge of a dying star system, its primary a bloated red giant that had long since swallowed its inner planets and was now slowly evaporating the frozen husks of its outer world. This was the Eridanus hub, once a thriving center of a forgotten civilization whose name had been lost to the fading, now nothing more than a graveyard of cooling iron and drifting ice. Aris watched the thermal scans of the red giant, its surface a mottled mess of convection cells and dying magnetic fields. Behind him, Sarah was overseeing the assembly of the first solar igniter, a device that looked less like a machine and more like a massive, silver dandelion seed. It was designed to pierce the heart of the star and inject a concentrated stream of low-entropy particles harvested from the Nexus. If it worked, the red giant would contract, its fusion cycles would reset, and it would return to a stable, yellow main sequence state. It was an act of planetary-scale alchemy, a defiance of the natural life cycle of stars that only a century ago would have been considered a heresy against physics. The pressure on the crew was immense. If the igniter failed, it could trigger a premature supernova, obliterating the very worlds they were trying to save. Jorah was busy monitoring the crew's stress levels, which were at an all-time high. The resonance had made them more attuned to one another's anxieties, and the bridge often felt like a pressure cooker of shared apprehension. Vane, however, remained a pillar of icy focus. Since his return from the Nexus, his understanding of energy dynamics had surpassed the ship's own computers. He sat at the navigation console, his eyes closed, feeling the gravitational currents of the system as if they were threads of silk. He wasn't just calculating the trajectory, he was composing a symphony of forces. The deployment began with a low-frequency pulse from the Calibrator's main array. The silver seed launched, its petals unfolding to catch the intense solar wind. As it descended toward the star, the ship's shields groaned under the heat. Aris kept his hand on the manual override, his eyes fixed on the star's luminosity curve. He could feel the collective breath of his crew being held. The igniter reached the transition zone, its outer shell glowing white-hot before it plunged into the plasma. For several minutes, there was nothing but the roar of static on the sensors. The red giant seemed to shudder, its outer atmosphere billowing outward in a desperate final gasp. Then the sensors flatlined, the star began to shrink. The contraction was visible to the naked eye. The bloated, angry red surface pulled inward, the color shifting through orange and gold until it settled into a brilliant, steady white gold. The gravity of the system recentered itself. The chaotic orbits of the remaining moons and asteroids began to smooth out, caught in the new, firm grip of the rejuvenated sun. It was as if the star had been given a second youth, its clock wound back by 5 billion years. Sarah let out a jagged laugh, half sob and half triumph. They had done it. They hadn't just fixed a machine, they had resurrected a star. The Eridanus Garden was no longer a theoretical project, it was a physical reality. But the star was only the foundation. To truly bring the system back to life, they had to address the derelict worlds. The largest remaining planet, a frozen giant named Ethelgard in the old charts, was their primary target. Using the atmospheric healers, nanitrich canisters designed to trigger runaway greenhouse effects and oxygen production, they began the long process of terraforming. This was the work of decades, but with the Xyloth technology, they could compress the initial stages into weeks. Aris led an away team down to the surface of Ethelgard, stepping out onto a landscape of nitrogen ice and black rock. The air was still unbreathable, but the sky above was a clear, hopeful blue, dominated by the newly minted sun. They planted the first biological markers, hardy, genetically engineered mosses and lichens that would begin the cycle of soil creation. It was a humble beginning, a few patches of green against a world of grey, but it was the most important step humanity had ever taken. They were no longer just observers of the universe, they were its active participants. Aris knelt on the frozen ground, his gloved fingers touching the tiny, resilient plants. He felt a sudden, sharp memory of Earth, of the smell of rain on hot pavement and the sound of wind through oak trees. He realized that they weren't just building a new world. They were carrying the memory of the old one forward, ensuring that the essence of life was never truly lost. As the weeks passed, Ethelgard began to transform. The nitrogen ice sublimated into a thick atmosphere, the black rocks were covered by an expanding carpet of green, and the first liquid water began to pool in the craters. The Calibrator stayed in orbit, acting as a temporary sun shield and communications hub. They were joined by other ships from the Initiative, a fleet of colonists and scientists who had come to turn the garden into a home. The excitement was infectious. For the first time in human history, there was no talk of scarcity or competition. The universe was suddenly vast again, filled with infinite potential. The Grand Accord was working. They were sharing the technology with any sentient species they encountered, turning the Eridanus supervoid into a beacon of cooperation. However, the rejuvenation process had unintended consequences. The sudden shift in the local gravitational and energetic balance had drawn the attention of the echoes, remnants of the fading that had taken on a semi-sentient form. These were not living beings in the traditional sense, but localized pockets of high entropy that fed on order and complexity. They appeared as shimmering, translucent clouds that drifted through the system, leaving a trail of dead matter in their wake. When one of these echoes approached Ethelgard, it threatened to undo months of work in a matter of hours. The atmospheric healers were being drained of their energy, and the new mosses were turning to grey dust. Aris realized that they couldn't fight entropy with weapons. You couldn't shoot a vacuum or bomb a lack of energy. They had to use the same principle that had worked at the reliquary and the anchor. They had to fill the void with consciousness. He ordered the Calibrator to move directly into the path of the echo. He called for another collective link, not just with his bridge crew, but with every colonist on the surface and every sailor in the fleet. They would create a field of mental resonance so strong that the echo would be forced to dissipate or be transformed. It was a risky move. The mental strain of connecting thousands of minds was untested, but there was no other choice. The link was established through the ship's primary transmitter. Aris felt the sudden, overwhelming surge of thousands of voices, a chaotic tide of hope, fear, and determination. He acted as the conductor, channeling this raw emotional energy toward the echo. He didn't focus on destruction, he focused on the memory of growth, the feeling of the sun on a leaf, and the joy of a child's first breath. The echo, which had been a dark, cold void, began to glow. The high-entropy field was being overwhelmed by the low-entropy energy of thought. It was like pouring light into a shadow. The shimmering cloud vibrated, its edges blurring, until it finally shattered into a harmless shower of photons. The system was safe, but the cost was high. Several members of the fleet suffered from neural exhaustion, and Aris himself felt a deep, bone-weary fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. Jorah insisted on a mandatory rest period for the entire crew. She pointed out that while they had the power of the Xyloth, they still had the bodies of humans. They could not spend themselves indefinitely. Aris sat in the darkened bridge, watching the sun set over the greening horizon of Ethelgard. He felt a profound sense of peace. They had faced the void and won, not through force, but through the sheer, stubborn persistence of their will to live. The Garden of Eridanus was only the beginning. There were thousands of other dead systems waiting to be woken up, thousands of other voids waiting to be filled. The Calibrator was already being refitted for its next journey, its hull scarred by the fires of the Red Giant, but its spirit unbroken. Aris knew that his time as commander was coming to an end. The next generation of explorers was already being trained, and they were more adapted to the new reality of the connected galaxy. But he wasn't sad. He had seen the stars change color. He had felt the heartbeat of 1 billion people. He had helped to turn a graveyard into a nursery. As the ship prepared to leave Eridanus, Aris stood on the observation deck with Sarah, Vane, and Marcus. They looked out at the vibrant, living world below and the steady, golden sun above. They were the ones who had seen the darkness and chosen to build a lamp. They were the ones who had heard the silence and chosen to sing. The universe was no longer a cold, indifferent machine. It was a garden, and they were its caretakers. And as the Calibrator slipped into the silver slipstream of the Loom, heading toward the next horizon, Aris felt the familiar hum of the hull and the steady beat of his own heart, a quiet, joyful rhythm that echoed across the stars. The final leg of the journey for the Calibrator did not lead to a distant nebula or a forgotten void, but back toward the center of the galaxy, to the very cradle where the first sparks of the human expansion had been ignited. The mission was no longer about repair or rejuvenation. It was about integration. The galaxy was now a living, breathing network of stabilized stars and connected minds, a masterpiece of cooperative engineering that spanned 100,000 light-years. Aris sat in his command chair, his hair now streaked with gray and his hands bearing the faint tremors of a life spent at the edge of the infinite. He watched the sensor feeds not for anomalies or threats, but for the sheer beauty of the symmetry they had created. The Loom was no longer a hidden infrastructure of the Xyloth. It was the nervous system of a unified galactic civilization. The destination was a system that had once been a symbol of the Fading's cruelty, a cluster of white dwarfs known as the Tears of Ophiuchus. These were the remains of a once great stellar nursery that had burned out prematurely, leaving behind a graveyard of cold, dense spheres. But today, the Tears were the site of the greatest engineering project in history. Under the guidance of the Restoration Corps and utilizing the combined efforts of a dozen different species, a Dyson swarm of unprecedented scale was being constructed. This wasn't a structure meant to harvest energy for a single world, but a galactic heart, a massive resonator designed to broadcast the low-entropy frequencies of the Nexus to every corner of the spiral arm simultaneously. It was the final step in ensuring the galaxy would never again fall prey to the thinning of reality. Aris felt the presence of his crew around him, a sensation that was now as natural as breathing. Sarah was in the engineering bay, her mind melded with the ship's core and the construction drones outside. She was no longer just a mechanic. She was a conductor, orchestrating the movements of thousands of autonomous units with the precision of a master weaver. Vane remained at the navigation console, his consciousness expanded to include the gravitational telemetry of the entire sector. He saw the universe not as a collection of objects, but as a series of interconnected waves, and he moved the calibrator through them with an effortless grace. Marcus was in the communications hub, translating the flood of data coming from the other species participating in the project, the avian-like Skrull, the lithic Thornkin, and the aquatic Cephlords. There was no more friction, no more misunderstanding. The resonance had given them a common language of the soul. As the final panel of the galactic heart was locked into place, a silence fell over the system. It was a weighted, expectant silence, the kind that precedes the first note of a long-awaited symphony. Aris looked at the viewscreen, where the massive swarm of silver mirrors surrounded the white dwarfs, capturing their faint, dying light and focusing it into a central focal point. In that point sat a replica of the anchor, built by human hands but powered by Xyloth wisdom. This was the moment of the resonant dawn. They were about to turn the entire galaxy into a sanctuary of life, a place where entropy would be held at bay not by force, but by the collective will of every sentient being within it. Aris received the signal from Bastion Prime. The High Chancellor, now an elder statesman of the Accord, gave the order to initiate the broadcast. Aris placed his hand on the primary activation crystal, feeling the warmth of the device. He didn't just press a button, he offered a thought. He thought of the long journey from the crystalline lattice of the reliquary to the green fields of Ethelgard. He thought of the friends they had lost and the futures they had secured. He thought of the simple, profound truth that had guided them through the dark, that no matter how vast the universe, no one should have to walk it alone. He pushed the thought into the crystal, and the galactic heart began to beat. A wave of iridescent light erupted from the focal point, a pulse of pure potential that rippled outward at speeds that laughed at the limitations of light. It washed over the calibrator, and for a moment, Aris felt as if he were being dissolved into a sea of stars. It wasn't the overwhelming union of the resonance, but something more refined, a gentle, persistent hum that settled into the background of his consciousness. It was the sound of the universe being put right. Across the galaxy, the effect was immediate. Dying stars flickered back to health, the echoes of the fading vanished like morning mist, and the very air on 1,000 worlds became sweeter and more vibrant. The resonant dawn had arrived, and with it, the assurance that the light of consciousness would endure until the end of time. The celebration that followed was not one of noisy parades, but of quiet, profound gratitude. On the bridge of the Calibrator, Jorah passed around a bottle of vintage earth wine she had been saving for just such an occasion. They toasted to the Xyloth, the architects of the path, to the initiative, the builders of the bridge, and to the crew of the Calibrator, the ones who had been brave enough to take the first step. Aris looked at his friends and felt a love so deep it transcended words. They had survived the void, the heat of dying suns, and the weight of 1 billion memories. They had come out the other side not as broken veterans, but as the patriarchs and matriarchs of a new age. As the ship began its slow journey back to Earth for the final decommissioning ceremony, Aris spent his time in the observation lounge, watching the stars. They looked different now, brighter, steadier, more welcoming. The galaxy was no longer a mystery to be feared or a resource to be exploited. It was a home. He thought about the Nexus Gate and the invitation the Xyloth had left behind. One day, humanity would walk through that gate, shedding their physical forms to join the Great Transition. But that day was far in the future. For now, they had worlds to plant, oceans to fill, and stories to tell. They had the breath of life, and they intended to use every bit of it. The Calibrator entered the Sol system on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. As they passed the orbit of Jupiter, they were met by a fleet of thousands of ships, not warships, but civilian vessels, science cutters, and family transports. It was a welcoming committee that spanned the entire reach of the inner planets. The radio frequencies were a joyous chaos of songs, cheers, and messages of thanks. Aris stood on the bridge, his uniform crisp and his back straight. He looked at the blue marble of Earth, the place where it had all started, and felt a sense of completion. They had left as scouts and returned as the saviors of the galaxy. The decommissioning ceremony was held at the site of the old Kennedy Space Center, beneath a sky that was now clear of the smog and debris of the industrial age. Thousands of people gathered to see the legendary ship and its crew. Aris stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, human, Skrull, and others, and he didn't speak of the technology or the battles against entropy. He spoke of the weight of a breath. He told them that every moment of life was a victory against the dark, and that the greatest power in the universe was the simple act of caring for one another. He told them that the Loom was not made of crystal or wire, but of the connections they forged between their own hearts. As the ceremony ended, the Calibrator was lifted into its permanent place in the Great Museum of the Stars. It would remain there as a testament to the era when humanity found its soul among the vacuum. Aris, Sarah, Vane, Marcus, and Jorah walked away from the ship for the last time, their footsteps light on the warm earth. They were retired now, their names etched into history, but their work would continue in the hands of the millions they had inspired. They walked toward the horizon, where the sun was setting in a spectacular display of gold and violet, a sunset that was beautiful precisely because it was temporary, and yet part of a cycle that would now last forever. Aris stopped for a moment, looking up as the first stars began to twinkle in the deepening twilight. He could still feel the faint, rhythmic beat of the galactic heart, a steady pulse that mirrored the rhythm of his own chest. He smiled, a bit of wit returning to his eyes. The universe was a big place, and they had certainly made a mess of the maps, but he wouldn't have had it any other way. He turned to his friends, his family, and gestured toward the lights in the sky. The dawn had passed, the day was won, and the night was no longer something to be feared. It was just a different kind of light. The story of the Calibrator was over, but the story of the resonant galaxy was just beginning. In the gardens of Eridanus, on the obsidian rings of Serpentis, and in the white halls of the Nexus Gate, life was flourishing in ways the Xyloth could only have dreamed of. Humanity had taken the broken pieces of a fading universe and woven them into a tapestry of infinite beauty. They had proven that the smallest breath, when shared with others, could carry the weight of the stars. And as the last of the sun's light faded from the sky, the galaxy began to glow with a light of its own, a light that would never go out, because it was fueled by the one thing entropy could never touch, the relentless, beautiful, and uplifting spirit of the human race.